This episode of Troxel is supported by Avail. Content is more than Revit families. If it's digital, Avail can handle it. Learn more at getavail.com. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. In this episode, I welcome Anthony Frausto-Robledo back to the podcast. Anthony is a practicing Boston-based architect and AEC technology editor and journalist at architosh.com. Today, we discuss two of Anthony's recent articles featured on Architosh, highlighting Autodesk. The first article is an interview with Autodesk CEO Andrew Anagnost, and the topic is their Autodesk University announcement of their forthcoming next-gen industry cloud platform for AEC called Forma, which is built upon their SpaceMaker acquisition. The second article is about the recent Nordic Open Letter, which builds upon the 2020 European Open Letter to Autodesk's CEO, penned by several significant architectural associations regarding, you guessed it, Revit development and value, or lack thereof, as the signatories indicate, as subscription costs have continued to rise. We also discuss a bit of disruption theory, network effects and positive externalities, switching costs and the sunk cost fallacy, how academia fits into the puzzle of technology training and the profession's expectations, how technology developers fit into the puzzle of professional practice operations in regards to dependency on the tech to fulfill business deliverables, dominance and power, Superman syndrome, and a short lesson in railroad track gauges. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to bring you my conversation with Anthony Frausto-Robledo. Anthony, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be back again.
Yeah, this is, I think you're the most visited guest of the podcast. It's been quite a while, though, since the last time.
It has, and I can't even remember the topic that we were talking about last time.
Yeah,
probably Apple related.
Well, I'll put some links to it in the show notes for if people like this conversation, they're bound to like those too, right? So I'm looking forward to this. You recently wrote a couple of articles on Architosh. So you're the editor of Architosh. I'd love maybe give a brief intro about that, catch people up on who you are. But the meat of this episode is really about these two topics that you wrote about. One of them about Autodesk making plans for the future and kind of previewing those to the public at AU. And you had an interview with the CEO there. And then you also kind of had this really great, insightful article, this great analogy, I should say, about past technologies and future technologies and kind of where we sit in that and kind of I don't know. I don't want to jump the shark yet. I want to get there when we get there, but I really enjoyed this other article. So I'll link to both of them in the show notes just so people can read them. If you want to read them before listening, cool. The links are there. If you want to listen to this first and then catch up with the articles later, that's fine too, of course. So Anthony, give us a kind of a quick synopsis of who you are, what you do, and your kind of particular perspective on AEC and technology in the industry.
Well, I'm an architect, and I have been one for a long time now, but I've been the editor of architosh.com for 21 years, 22 years now. And so I do two things. I practice architecture, and I write about the digital technologies that affect it. Architosh is really famous because in 1999, at some of the darkest hours for Apple in the late 90s, we came along and started to address the informational needs of users in AEC, but mostly in architecture specifically, who are still fighting for the Mac and were on the Mac platform, like myself. And over the last decade, we've shifted that focus to broaden beyond the Mac. And that probably began when Apple came out with the iPhone in 2007, and especially accelerated with the iPad in 2011 now, right? So for the last decade, we have been talking about all technologies across all devices and platforms impacting AEC and related industries. And I would say that my unique vantage point that I offer the industry in terms of perspective comes from the fact that I am a practitioner and not just a writer about these technologies, but I live in the trenches with all the difficulties and issues that everyone else is living with.
Yeah, and I think that timeline kind of matches up with when I first became familiar with Architosh, being an early Mac and Form Z and MicroStation on the Mac user from way back in the day, and kind of religiously following the newsletter, the blog. And I guess I appreciate about this kind of constant voice that you have on the website and in the long form format, not unlike this podcast, I guess. And you tend to dig pretty deeply, and you're not just linking out to other stories, but you're connecting dots and you're going in depth, and you're really thinking about where things are heading and kind of tracking. Especially, I remember there's been so much kind of consternation about Apple hardware over the years and pro level machines, right? Mac Pro, iMac Pro, like all of these things have just kind of been the things that a lot of frustrated Apple users in the AEC space have kind of honed in on. And then for things to truly change in dramatic ways, hardware wise, but not necessarily software wise. And I think it's kind of industry problem, like it's industry scale problem of not that many tools still being available on the Mac. I wouldn't say we're hurting too much. There's definitely options out there, but it is interesting to see kind of the 800-pound gorilla still not on the Mac, right? And that's potentially changing with things moving into the cloud, right, where we're accessing software through SaaS models in the browser, more and more so all the time. So it's been a fascinating journey to kind of go along that with you and to have that constant voice. Like you said, 21 years, it's a long time.
Yeah, it feels like it forever, actually. And but I still enjoy it immensely because I keep learning. And when I started this, I didn't have a background in journalism other than participating in the theory praxis journal at my architectural college and the school newspaper kind of stuff. But I've always enjoyed writing, and I've always enjoyed teaching and explaining things. So when I jumped into this, it very much was initially about sort of helping myself to some degree as a architect on the Mac platform, but I soon got very excited about helping others. Kind of, I don't know, back then it seemed like we were like the rebel alliance against the big empire. So as a current Star Wars fan, enjoying the Andor series immensely, it's fun to kind of think about the origins of Architosh, because that series,
the origins of the Rebel Alliance.
Yeah, the origins of the Rebel Alliance, exactly.
That's awesome.
But in all seriousness, what's fun about those kinds of stories and these analogies is that they do bear out, real emotions with the technologies that we actually do have and enjoy and love. And for me, I think it's really important that we use tools that we love. I think when you are using a tool that you really, really enjoy, and you're very, very connected to, I think you perform your best work.
I'm smiling because let's talk about Revit, Anthony. Talking about software that people love and people love to hate. I mean, this is one of those things where people long for that relationship with the tools they use every day. Like there's tools in my actual toolbox, in my actual physical workshop, that are old and beat up and patinaed, and they are my favorite tools. And they've been through everything with me, right? And they're the go-to tools, the ones you pull out on practically every project, and you'll never get rid of them. And there's some newer tools that never even get used because the old tools will work even if they're not exactly the right tool. They just feel better for some reason. There's a lot of analogies with digital tools in that way too, right? And I think that's why people do like using the Mac. I mean, just to get back to that, right? There's something for certain people, that's something that really matters to them. And, I'm sure we're in that boat. So I just want to, it's kind of funny, right? Because Revit is kind of the industry's whipping boy when it comes to a tool that a lot of people use that they don't enjoy using. And not to say like that's just a total generalization, right? There's a lot of people making a fantastic living using Revit all the time. And there's a lot of people who have made a living knowing how to use Revit in an expert way and teaching others how to do the same thing. And I mean, the industry does, for the most part in North America, at least, run off Revit. So it's pretty interesting to think about that. So I just thought it would be fun to start off that way because you just left that door wide open for me.
No, not a problem. And, you know, just to add to that, there are many people who absolutely love Revit. Mm-hmm. And some of the people who are the Revit Open Letter signatories, the people who are passionately against the Open Letter, for, I say not against, but for the Open Letter, are self-professed Revit fanboys or girls.
Sure.
And so, you know, you're right. People do get connected to the technology. That investment in technology that we make to our tools has a huge impact on the market dynamics as well. And that's part of the reason why I took this path when I wrote this latest epic on Architosh, because I wanted to talk about the dynamics of software adoption and the nature of these dynamics as they relate to the fact that the net benefits for the adoption of a system increase as more people adopt the system. Mm-hmm. These network effects are very real and very tangible, and they have significant value to the equation of how you think about the tools that you are using. And it did seem fruitful this time with this second Nordic Open Letter to take the path that I took the first time, which was, let's talk to some disgruntled users. Let's talk to some resellers on other platforms and the same platform. And let's talk to some competitors. You know, that path was interesting and enlightening to hear the emotions behind why people were so passionate about writing this angry, 2020 version of the Open Letter. But this time, I didn't want to take that path. I wanted to do something that I thought would contribute to the dialogue that can get us to a better place in the industry.
One of the things that Andrew says in your article on Forma, so this is Andrew Anagnost, who is the CEO of Autodesk. He says, everyone involved in architecture, including tool providers, needs to reimagine themselves for the profession to survive. And I think it's really interesting to be putting that out there. And I think, part of that is them saying, we're going to solve for the technology piece of that, but there's other pieces of that. And you talk about some of those in your article, right? The economic side of that, the practice side of that. There's other parts that architects have to be responsible for. And I think one thing that I always try to keep in mind as I read these, this is basically forecasting the future by a tech CEO and talking about these things, is that architects, I say it all the time, there's two things architects hate: the way things are and change. Right? And it's architects in these open letters are demanding more from Autodesk and other software companies, I'm sure, but Autodesk is the one who's been named because everybody who's signing these letters relies on them for their business. And yet, what are they doing for their own business to take advantage of these things? Like, it's very interesting to me to think about this from a training point of view. I mean, I was actually really surprised to hear from you at the beginning of the episode that firms are asking for AI-driven solutions, because I wonder how much they're investing in those kinds of solutions now, or research into those to understand if that's what they really want or not. Like I could see a tech company saying, this is how we're going to approach it. Like that's because that's what they're doing with SpaceMaker, right? Mm-hmm. But I was surprised to hear that firms are asking for that, because for the most part, I see firms struggling to adopt technology, to invest in technology, in new technology, I should say, new workflows, new ways of doing work. And because it's all about higher efficiency in the way that we've always done things, right? Which is why there is so many complaints about
Revit and the tools that are broken that have never been fixed kind of a thing. Like, just fix the tools that are there is what a lot of people talk about all the time. And these companies have no clue what it takes to develop software, how much money it takes, how much time it takes. And so, I mean, for Andrew to say this is going to take a long time, this basically saying, like, this is not going to happen overnight. Don't expect it to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. I'm sure that turns a lot of people off, but also, like, they just have no idea what it actually takes to do it. And from everybody that I know that is on the tech and the software side, on that side, they know how hard it is. They know how tall of an order that is. And especially when people say, I want it fast, right? I want it now. I want this new technology yesterday, is just coming from a place of not understanding what it's actually like. So there was a lot in there. I realized I was rambling, but I think it's interesting that a software company, going back to this quote, is saying that the profession has to reimagine themselves in order to survive. And again, you kind of talked about some different ways in which the profession needs to tackle that for themselves. And Autodesk is saying, we've got the tech part, right? You've got other things to do, though, in order for it to be successful. You want to talk about what some of those other ways are? Because I see these architectural firms, I guess, hoping that this tech is going to solve it all for them.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's going to solve it all for them. I've been talking to many firms related to the open letter and firms that are not related to the open letter. One of the things that I ask everyone now is I ask them to give me an average assessment of the average skill of someone on their chosen platform, from A to Z, A being a newbie and Z being, Master Yoda level abilities. I asked them, where is your average user on that spectrum, the alphabetic spectrum? And they generally say somewhere in the middle between like M and R, right? Which is related to, and let me just back up for a second. I've been working on trying to put some economic math to the problem of how beneficial it is to train people to get more advanced skills. And I've taken basically the alphabet and broke it into 6 groups. So there's beginner, there's advanced beginner, there's intermediate, advanced intermediate, there's expert, and advanced expert. So what letters exactly, there's 5 or 6 letters per group or something, like 4 to 5 letters per group. So when their average user, like at Big, their average Revit user is somewhere between M and P. Okay. But Gens at Big will say, but we have a lot of people who are actually in the expert category and some who are maybe advanced experts. And that's why they can do so many amazing things that they do, because they have a good number of experts. And you'd have to have a good number of expert users to do things. Now, the average architectural firm in America is a small firm, right? That 85% of all firms are small.
Majority.
So small firm, say a 10-person firm. That firm may have their best Revit user may be barely into the expert category group, or an advanced intermediate person, like a very advanced intermediate, but not expert. And everyone else is going to be many notches, many letters below them. So the way I look at it is, if you talk to architects who have not jumped to Revit, who are clinging on to platforms they've been using for 25 years, maybe they haven't jumped to BIM. When you really look at a lot of these folks who are, some might say they're stuck, they are almost uniformly on the expert side of the spectrum. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is they've had a lot of time in the platform and they've accrued a lot of knowledge. 2, they didn't want to jump ship from whatever minority alternative platform they're on. So they've redoubled their efforts to prove that they can be just as effective on their tool of choice. And these people have acquired skills in the sense that they know not only that there are maybe a dozen ways of doing things, a certain thing, but they know exactly what is the best way in certain circumstances. They have acquired advanced skills in knowing how to customize the interface, to optimize it for their specific workflows. They've maybe acquired scripting skills. And some of them, the most advanced users, the expert users, the advanced experts. And I differentiate between advanced experts and experts as people in advanced experts can code a little bit. They can get behind the hood of a tool. Mm-hmm. And that's where you find people like on PowerCAD, for instance, like a platform no one talks about anymore. But the few people who talk to me about that tool, they can code, they can script, they have incredible skills. So where I'm going with this is, if you put a person who is an advanced beginner in Revit, and you compare what they can get done in a day or a week against someone who is an expert Revit user, what kind of delta do you expect to see between that work product, right? That's a really good question to ask. And when I ask different people, if I ask a BIM trainer, if I ask a Revit trainer, they're going to throw a big number at it because they're promoting training, right? Mm-hmm. They want to promote training. If I ask someone who's a digital design director, they're going to put a slightly different number on it. And if you ask the actual user, especially the more beginner one, they're going to devalue the impact they have as a beginner compared to someone who's been using the tool for a long time. So the truth is, those numbers are unknown in the industry. No one has been benchmarking any of this stuff. The tools don't benchmark it. Research in academia is not benchmarking it. No one's benchmarking it. So one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out if, in truth, it actually is economically better to stay on a platform you're on than jump to maybe the majority platform, which is a net benefit you in positive externalities and network effects, right? Like some of the ones that we talked about in this article, mm-hmm. like access to experienced people, mm-hmm. Or jump. Is it better to jump or is it better to stay where you are? And I think that's a tough calculus to come up with, but I think there is a way to do it. I think there's a way of thinking through that problem. And I also think there's a way of thinking through benchmarking tools so that the people who are in the Open Revit Letter group, some of them, as you saw in the article, talked about, well, we're actually trying this now. Zaha Hadid, they said their principal in charge of this digital stuff, said, we're looking at everything now, right? Other people are saying, we're looking at other BIM solutions. We're using them now. We're going to benchmark them in 2 years. Well, what does that benchmarking look like? And how do you share that with the rest of the industry so right. They too can maybe benchmark? Right. So I think there's a lot of things that are not tried yet in the industry. And so when the industry throws up its hands and starts to cry about lack of efficiency and rising costs, what they're basically saying is that the economics are not making sense for them anymore and it's hurting them. Well, they also are lacking the skill set to do something about that in a way that is the way people do it in big business, the way consultants come in and help big companies sort out problems like IBM or something. They don't have the means to those assets and skill sets. And that's a problem that I think should be solved in academia. Because I think it's kind of silly that you can have colleges of architecture put robots or robotic arms and this kind of emerging tech inside of their labs and classrooms and so forth, and talk to their students and the parents of the students to say, we're preparing your kids for the future because this tech over here is the future. But at the same time, not prepare them to have the understanding of how you can optimize your own industry and giving them the skill set to go out and do that. And that's something I mentioned in the article too, when I talk a little bit about academia's role in all of this. Academia's role in contributing to this cycle that perpetuates the snowball effect, where the platform that gets out a little bit ahead of everyone else gains these network effects, these positive externalities that then cause the snowball to go even faster. And then the next thing you know, everyone is invested in one tool more than all the others combined. And you have some holdouts. And, if we wanted to talk about the holdouts, that's an interesting question, right? Mm-hmm. Who are the holdouts and why did they hold out? I mentioned earlier why they hold out, right? Because they've developed advanced skill capacities, but somewhere in the process of developing those skill sets on these alternative platforms who end up in the minority market share group, they have acquired some kind of knowledge about how their own increase in their skills contributes to the bottom line in their practice. And they know this firsthand because those practices are often small and they've experienced this in a very intimate way where it's not something that is being told to them. They've experienced it because they've lived it. And I have this theory that if I go around the world and continue to ask all the largest firms in the world that are using Revit about where their average user is, they will all be between M and R. Mm-hmm. It's just going to be the case. But if I go around the world and talk to some of the firms that maybe are smaller on alternative platforms, I may get a different kind of answer. I may get a little bit more advanced level answer. It may be a little. The needle may be farther to the left or to the right if we're looking at the alphabet. And I think where I'm going with this is I think this kind of knowledge should be studied in the industry. It should be benchmarked. There should be efforts underway to understand this. And that's one thing that people can do in response to a tool that is taking over the world, but somehow underperforming.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it just gets more and more complex every year, right? I mean, there's its own kind of innovation curve and versus adoption curve. Like you've adopted the tool in many cases, but you can't keep up with even the tool set itself, right? That the nuance of the program itself and the year-over-year changes are things that people can be extremely unaware of, don't even know certain features exist. I can't tell you how many times. And I'm sure it happens every single day where it's like, oh, I didn't even know it could do that. Like that's a common statement for the software that somebody has been using over a decade, right? Mm-hmm. It happens all the time. There's a lot of things in there that we could talk about. I think one of the things that is interesting to me about change and change management and why somebody might not want to adopt a new tool. And I think that maybe a similar vision or future could be cast for Forma itself, right? Which is because, like you said, Autodesk has been through this before. They were successful in implementing the new 800-pound gorilla to kind of upset the old 800-pound gorilla, which was AutoCAD, right? And obviously people still use that, and there's other people who are in a similar story, different tool set, right? There's people out there who have not moved to the next thing, but Autodesk, I would probably venture to say they feel successful about getting people into the Revit tool, but they have a road ahead that where man, it's going to take a while for that software to get enough functionality for people to want to use it and to put their business on the line to deliver a project using it. I see that's why new software has such a hard time getting adopted too, right? Because it doesn't do everything from beginning to end, or it doesn't do it all really well. And so now you're kind of cobbling together a series of tools to accomplish similar results to what you could have done in one, in which you were maybe a quote unquote expert in. And anyway, I feel like there's so many things kind of fighting against the change here. Some of the things that I've witnessed myself are obviously a lot of training. There's a lot of encoded knowledge in the workforce in a particular tool and your consultants, right, who use the same software, let's just say, in this example. And so moving to something else would be extremely difficult because you have to convince everybody else to hopefully do the same thing with you. And the learning curve is not an overnight thing, right? It's not going to happen. So how do you do that on top of the deadlines you already have? And this is why I think so many people feel stuck and they're so pissed that the tool doesn't seem to be getting better or delivering more value for the higher costs, right? Is like, we can't change because we're so embedded in the tool that we have and it's not getting better. And there are other options out there, but man, the learning curve is we can't take the time to do that. So how do we do that?
Yeah, it's very true. It's all this technology takes a lot of effort. I think we might address this issue by thinking about just the nature of the device, right? So if we think about, we go back to IBM in the mainframe phase of technology, right? At that time, during the era of IBM, they were the big 800-pound gorilla in the market. Mm-hmm. And all the focus on investment, innovation, and company creation at that time was directed around serving the interests of people who were on the dominant device at the time, which was the mainframe. At that moment, they controlled the platform, and they dominated the device. When the PC came during that era, it started to get a little bit more democratized, and it started to get a little easier, right? Regular people could have a computer now called a PC. We still ended up with a single kind of dominant platform, Windows, controlled by Microsoft, and all the focus of investment and innovation and company creation was still directed serving the interests of the dominant client at the time, which was the Windows PC. I mean, there was the Mac out there, but for the most part, we all know that Windows won the day and essentially crushed the Mac, right? By the late 80s, the Mac was in single-digit share.
Right.
Similar to the share of what they used to call IBM and Big Blue and the Seven Dwarfs or something, like all the smaller competitors it had. So, but we ended up with a lot of client devices made by a lot of different people, right? Mm-hmm. You had HP, Compaq. So it wasn't just one company dominating that space. It was much more pluralized. Now we're living in the cloud era, and the cloud is the platform, and the winning devices, there is more than ever. But the device at the time, right now, where the real power is and where investment is directed in company creation is around mobile devices. It's around the smartphone. Mm-hmm. That's the big device that dominates everything. And when you throw iPads and mobile tablets in there, it gets even larger. So the PC now is a much smaller place in terms of sheer numbers. But it too is still an end device that people are using. And people are still using mainframes. So, we keep using the things that we used that used to be the primary device. They just don't. The investment energy is just not in them anymore. The big dollars are in the new technology. Where I'm going with this is that there is a pattern in this where things get more democratized. So if we look at the platform today as the cloud, no one controls it. Mm-hmm. We have Google, Amazon, Microsoft, even IBM. Everyone's a cloud player, kind of. And we have a whole range of industry develop around the cloud that couldn't work without the cloud. Airbnb couldn't work without. Uber couldn't work without the cloud. So the cloud is where everything's at now. And one thing that Andrew is saying about Forma that's really spot on is he's recognizing that the center of computing has moved to the cloud mm-hmm. and to mobile devices. Mm-hmm. And yet the tool that they own and control that has real power in the market, I want to talk about power just briefly in a moment, is a tool that comes from the previous era.
Yep, right.
And so if we look at what happened to the companies that were developing around the mainframe, and then when the PC came, and then the PC, and then when the web and the cloud came, is there's a whole, they fell into the background a bit. And I think Autodesk doesn't want that to happen to them. I think they're trying, as they said, rightfully so, during their keynote, they aim to disrupt themselves.
Yeah.
And that is the key term. This is disruption.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not alone, because there's some new people out there like Infernia and Snaptrude. There are some new era devices that are cloud mobile first, or at least cloud centric.
Right.
And they're going at the BIM industry with some different kinds of assumptions about what a BIM tool should be. And I think that is an important aspect to all of this.
Yeah.
I know people are thinking of like, oh, this is great. I've spent all this effort getting to Revit and BIM, and now there's this new thing. Well, it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, it's going to be a decade effort.
Right. Yep. Yeah, agreed. It is kind of interesting to think of it on those terms, where the thick client that used to be the mainframe and the thin client was all the desktop computers is now further bigger and smaller at the same time, right? Thick client is cloud now, thin client is mobile device, and it's more of a platform that just accesses via, remote computing, all the heavy lifting that's going on out there. And this idea of disrupting themselves makes a lot of sense, in that they don't want somebody else to do it to them, right? That absolutely makes sense when you hear it. It'll be interesting to see that if it actually happens, and what that means, and how long it takes. I mean, he's trying to squash expectations of speed and this happening very quickly. Autodesk doesn't seem to do anything very quickly, right? But yet it still makes sense to temper expectations, probably a better way to say it, just to say, like, this is going to take time to do this, so don't expect it to change. But also, like, Revit's not going away right now. There's a lot of things that have to continue as the new things are being built for someday the full switch over to actually happen, right? And that's got to be a long roadmap, just based on previous performance and experience. Let's take a quick break to share more about our sponsors. You've heard about Avail here on the Troxel podcast, and I'm excited to tell you they have a new message for you, my friends. Avail is designed by designers for design professionals, so it's no wonder Avail focuses on visuals in its platform. While Avail has always provided high-resolution previews, there are some new visual enhancements you should know about. These are channel cards and key cards. They're visual gateways to your content, and they're both customizable. Channel cards have been available since Avail Desktop 4.0. Think of them like album covers for each content channel you create. Channel cards are designed to make navigating your firm's assets quick and easy. And with channel cards, the look and feel of Avail conforms with your firm's standards. Next up is key cards, and these are the latest addition to Avail and are available since version 4.3. What are they? Key cards visually group content within a channel, and they derive data from your tags to make finding content easier. So they're created from the work you've already done. By adding custom graphics to your key cards, navigating content within a channel improves immediately. Key cards also drive the breadcrumb trail in the latest Avail Desktop 4.3 release. Navigate through your channels using breadcrumbs. And a new breadcrumb control is displayed on a channel when navigating with key cards. Breadcrumb items allow the user to navigate to the previous state easily. To see all of these new visual enhancements in action, head over to getavail.com to learn more. That's getavail, GETAVAIL.com to learn more. And now let's get back to our conversation.
You know about the adoption cycles, and there's going to be 5 phases of people who adopt technology through a long curve.
Mm-hmm.
It gets very real and interesting when the early majority are now picking up a tool.
Yeah.
But we're probably a few years away from where the early majority group, which is a big group, start to jump into Forma. Now, the Zaha Hadid's of the world, the Bigs of the world, they are going to jump. A lot of these people on the Open Letter group might jump into Forma as soon as there's something to jump into. Some of them have already explored SpaceMaker.
Sure.
Some of them were not impressed with SpaceMaker. The difference with the letter group, their needs and maybe where Andrew is pointing Autodesk in terms of AEC is, I think the group is thinking about technology transformation in a different kind of time frame of reference. And I think for Autodesk, they have to be aware of being disrupted. And so they can't, they always, if you have read a lot about disruption, how companies get disrupted, it's when you actually are paying attention to the majority of your customers and just only paying attention to the vast majority of your customers, you can get disrupted from something below you.
Sure.
So I think they're being smart about looking at disruption from the vantage point of focus, and who you want to be able to focus on your customers, but you can't take your eye off what's coming up underneath you. And, right now the smartphone is the most universal device in the world. I mean, that's the thing. When the mainframe was around, only big companies had it. When the PC came around, it was first, then it was companies and people. And then when the web came, it pushed the PC to almost everybody, but not around the whole world, right? Only to advanced nations with people who have money. The smartphone, however, has much greater penetration around the whole world. It's phenomenal. So if we think about the next device and what that is, will that take us to complete coverage, essentially, of the entire planet? If it's AR glasses, will they be cheap enough for every human being to wear? How does that change the nature of computing for us? And how does that change where the center of innovation, investment, and company creation goes? And how might that impact AEC? I think these are some of the longer time frame perspectives that people need to pay attention to. Meanwhile, the thing that I like to point out to some people who are frustrated with Revit is to recognize the fact that Autodesk has real power in AEC. And I read an interesting article recently that I reference a lot in the article that I've written inside of the upcoming newsletter from Benedict Evans, who's a British tech analyst, and he talked about power in one of his articles, and he said that power is being able to make people do things that they don't want to do. So when we hear, and that's different than dominance. You can have, like, everyone talks about big tech and the dominance of big tech, but can Apple really make you do things that you don't want to do? Like, does Google really have the power to make you do you're only going to do internet searches on our search engine? They don't. You're not forced to. You can try the others. There's several. But when you hear open letter firms telling you that they're not going to be able to get contracts if they don't deliver a Revit deliverable,
right?
That's power,
right?
When you hear them saying, "We didn't choose this for the capabilities of the tool. We chose it because all the consultants are using it, and we need to be able to work with them better."
Right.
That's when you're doing something you don't maybe want to really do, but there are these other incentives that are causing you to do it. And I think technology in general, as we move forward to these, when the center of the industry shifts, power can shift, and especially with the main platforms. But will it shift with some of the main app winners on these platforms, right? Adobe has managed to put Photoshop on iPad in a really beautiful way. I don't know the details of how successful that is, but no BIM leader out there has managed to reimagine what BIM could be in this new cloud-centric world. Everyone's still on a desktop tool, essentially. They're surrounded by little tools that go around them that do AEC things, whether it's BIMX for Graphisoft or Nomad for Vectorworks, or all the little tools that Bentley and Autodesk have that do very precise things. But, there's never going to be Revit in the web browser. Right. That's what we've heard from Autodesk. That's what Andrew said specifically.
Yeah. Well,
But
and
what
look at those platforms and how long they've been around. Like the legacy of the code base is just it's an old tool, and it's not a modern tool. Like and by definition, it can't do the things that people want these new inventions to do in with old software. Like it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen.
never going to happen, right? And so the point about power is that with Forma, Autodesk is going to be very challenged to maybe maintain its power. But it depends on what Forma really is. A lot of people, like if you read, there's venture capitalists out there that just talk about network effects. To them, they say that 70% of the value of a platform or the value of tech is actually in network effects rather than the actual product itself. And they advise that, when you go when you're investing or you're a startup guy or whatever, that you got to go for the kill. You want the whole market, right? So you're gonna avail yourself of every network effect possible to give you, advantages. Unfair advantage. I'm not sure if it's unfair advantage, but advantages so that you can get the whole market, so you can annihilate competition. But the thing about Forma is when we listen to Autodesk talk about Forma, and they're saying to the Open Letter group, we're going to address your concerns about working with non-Autodesk tools. We're going to address your concerns about you owning the data, that it's your intellectual property. You designed these buildings. Are they really going to deliver that?
Right.
Or is this just a platform that is going to going to aim to crush all other platforms?
Right.
And is it going to be a platform that has such powerful network effects too, that it's going to have real power and people are going to have no choice but to use it? So that's the thing that's interesting about this, because when we look at the whole AEC industry and we look at the tools that are on the construction side, they're extremely democratized and pluralized. There's a lot of, from Oracle to Procore in the United States to Autodesk to all these tools around the world, there are extremely good competitors vying for everyone's attention. And that's what's missing to some degree on the design authoring side, right?
Right. Yeah. When you mentioned earlier that you feel like academia needs to play a stronger role in the technology training side. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So how would that play into like this part of the narrative, right? Because if it is reinforcing of a particular tool set by nature, because in academia, what can you do? They don't, for the most part, they don't teach software as it is right now because they're busy teaching other things, design, some pro practice, very little, right? Structures, things like that. When I was teaching at university, they got to the point where they were not teaching anybody how to use a particular program. They just got everybody LinkedIn Learning. Like the whole campus just had the ability to tune into LinkedIn Learning and learn something and apply it to their studio course, because they couldn't squeeze it in. They couldn't squeeze anything else into the curriculum as it stood. But if they do have to pick, how does that paint a future of, options? I'm not quite sure that it could.
Yeah, my belief is I don't think academia should be picking the winners. I don't think they should be contributing to the cycle. I don't think that academia should be part of the network effects. I think what schools should do they should do two things. One is, like you said, they should give all students the resources to learn anything they want. So the LinkedIn thing sounds fantastic, right? And there could be more than LinkedIn. There could be lots of different ways they can expose students to stuff. Because what you want students to do is you want them to interrogate the terrain of digital tools so that they can approach digital tools with an entrepreneurial mindset, not an end user mindset. They want to be entrepreneurial. The industry is changing dramatically as we go towards the future of automation. And there's all this talk about like, oh, will AI take over architecture? Will AI take over this? Will robotics take over construction? Well, we don't know. We honestly don't know these questions. But what we should be doing is getting students to think about these questions very deeply. And to do that, we need to put them in more of an entrepreneurial framework where they can use they're an architecture school. They're creatives. They should be using their creative capacity to think through these problems. Then you marry that with business and economic education. Not any business and economic education, but the business of design.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some good people out there who have written excellent stuff on the business of design.
Mm-hmm.
I'll mention one in a second, but when it comes to economics, there is incredible education out there in business schools about technology and economics and business. I think students need to be exposed to that, and so that they can have a framework and some skill sets to think about how they're going to optimize technology to do the things that they envision need to be done to not only survive automation, but to thrive in automation.
And I agree with that, and I want you to name who you're going to name, but I'm glad to hear you say this, because I'm tracking totally with this, because it really is about a different way of applying technology to design practice specifically, and that does not mean through drawing, right? It means in systems thinking. It means in generating workflows and building off automation and using it so that we can really be doing our most valuable and meaningful contribution to the process where humans matter the most, and actually leveraging technology. Because I feel like the past has really been like the fight between profession and academia has been about preparation for being the CAD monkey, right? There's been this kind of fight there where schools are like, no, that's not what we train people for. And businesses are like, well, that's what I want to hire somebody to do. And they're at odds about that kind of a thing. So I'm glad that you kind of cleared that up for me, because I was interested to hear your take on that. But I do agree. It really needs to be about kind of these applying technology in really useful ways that I don't think necessarily strategically happens in firms because of the legacy mindset of like, we hire people to draw, right? Those are very different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I was involved with a tech startup in Boston several years ago, there was a MD in the group, and he was learning everything about the architecture industry. And when I would characterize kind of what you said about this rift between architecture school and practice, he said that felt very similar to what's been happening to doctors. Mm. And I thought that was really interesting. I think that one has to be very careful about letting industry dictate the terms of education, because industry today is extremely self-serving and profit-oriented. Mm-hmm. And we're experiencing this, or those who are in medicine are experiencing this, and those who are close to those fields know a little bit about those pressures. But I think part of the challenge is you do need to justify the cost of education in the United States. It's very expensive, right? And so on the one hand, you could understand why schools of architecture would prepare students for the tools that are most in demand. That's very understandable. But at the same time, that's a short-term thinking kind of view, right?
Right.
If you really care about the students' welfare, their social welfare throughout their career, and if you even are concerned about your own welfare as an architecture school, you better be thinking about the long-term picture for the profession of architecture.
Right.
And in this particular time, I think people need to be thinking about that in a more complicated way. So I've recently encountered learning about some schools. There's a school now, a new fourth architecture school in New Zealand, that is really stepping out of the old mode of architecture school, and where the education of architects is so silo oriented. You do your projects on your own. You come into studio, present on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go into the world and you don't do anything on your own. Yeah. You're in a team. Right. This was the point that was made by Lane Godwin, who was the former partner at Foster, who partners, who was quoted in the article about that instruction of technology in schools isn't really happening the way it should be happening. Yes, you can actually have instruction about Revit or Rhino or SketchUp, but what's missing is instruction that teaches people how to work together in groups, doing the kinds of things that firms are actually doing on the scale of projects that firms generally do, right? Not these little kind of projects that we do in school, or which tend to be on the smaller side, because that's what we can kind of tackle reasonably in a studio where we're doing all the work ourselves, right? I know I'm citing how education was for when we were in school more, and I know that it has been changing. Mm-hmm. I know that from just critting and seeing how students are working, but they're still doing their projects by themselves. And I think that that's a problem, and I think that needs to change.
Yeah, agreed. I want to get to your other article as well, the Revit Open Letter through the lens of Quasi-Irreversible. And sure. I just want to open up with this quote that you start the article with by economist Milton Friedman. He said, "The most important single fact about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit." And I mean, this gets back to the letter, but the whole idea of coordinamics and where your analogy is coming from. Can you paint that? Let's paint that picture and jump into that part of the conversation, because this is, I think, pretty insightful.
Sure. So I have been reading a lot about the history of technology since the Industrial Revolution. And I've written about some people like Carlota Perez several times on Architosh, who I think is offers the best model of 5 phases of techno-economic paradigm shifts since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So in the fifth era that we're in the information age. We're in the age that was born when the silicon chip was born in the 70s, and we're still in this phase. But the next phase, I'm not sure what that's going to be called. But the bottom line is, I've been reading a lot about economics, and so I came across these papers, and specifically Paul Anthony David's landmark article from 1985 called Clio and the Economics of QWERTY, that talked about the keyboard layout that we all use, the QWERTY keyboard layout, mm-hmm. and how that came about and how that may have represented market failure. And so the history of that, just briefly for the listener, is that our keys are the way they are, positioned on their keyboard, QWERTY on the top left, largely because when typewriters were invented, they were trying to figure out how to make these machines, and they had these arms that would move up and crash into the bar and the I don't know, ink-infused paper. I don't know what they call it now.
Yeah, that ribbon. Yeah.
That ribbon, right? And if you type too fast, these bars would come up at the same time, and they'd get locked together. They'd kind of crash, and that would mess everything up. So the way I understand it is the keyboard was laid out optimally to prevent that problem from happening. It has nothing to do with typing speed. And it has nothing to do with a balance of what words would you type on the left hand versus the right hand. And it turns out QWERTY is more left hand dominant. So it's not balanced. It's like having a, I don't know, 4-cylinder engine, and like, I don't know, 2 of the cylinders are kind of working like at half level or something like that. So it turns out that mechanical problem actually got solved rather quickly in the evolution of the history of the typewriter.
The machine itself, right?
Yeah, the machine itself.
Right.
But what happened was we ended up with the QWERTY layout because it won over the market, because someone opened a school and started training people in this layout. And those first typists, which I'm sure were almost all women, were like the first versions of software because their skill set had a technical interrelatedness with these machines.
Right.
And they were compatible, in other words. So that was how Clio and the economics of QWERTY came into the equation in my article, because what's distressing about reading about the open letter is that we hear people talk about Revit, for example, not being multi-threaded enough compared to some of its rivals. And it's very inefficient in utilizing today's chips, which are multi-threaded, multi-core, and can run many threads at once. And, the question was, there was there were other keyboard layouts like Dvorak keyboard that, like the Navy studied just after World War II and proved was more efficient and would save substantial amount of time, and the net return on investment would be worth switching to. It didn't happen. The market would have none of it. Everyone settled on QWERTY, and it was totally entrenched.
Sunk costs, right? Like it's
yeah. So typing doesn't seem like a big deal to anyone anymore. So if that's market failure, and in terms of some lost proficiency because we're on the wrong keyboard, so be it. People will just move on. But a BIM tool that's a market failure is a bigger deal. So we can go through some other market failures that we all know, like VHS versus Betamax. Mm-hmm. Now, in the end, that didn't matter. We have Netflix now. We stream movies, right? But that was another kind of market failure. Another one, we could debate whether the Mac versus the PC was a market failure.
Right.
So I've been fascinated with these things for a couple reasons. One was David's articles pointed to something that was really interesting called defining path dependency, which is when it roughly means when a technology is path dependent, it means that future innovations on that line of technology are constrained to the limitations of this kind of non-reversible dynamic in the evolution of that technology. A good example is, maybe the best example is rail gauge, right? The distance between train tracks, which, as you know, the history of the train and the railroad started in Britain, and rail gauge kind of started at this dimension that maybe is not so optimal for the new kinds of things that we would do today. Sure. So we're using rail to move things out of mines. This was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Coal mines, right? Those kinds of things. And other products. But no one back then was imagining bullet trains. And people back then weren't imagining the kinds of engines on trains that would change, kind of strokes that they'd have, and the size of these engines, and the optimal engineering of these of this technology, or things like the BART system in San Francisco. Right, the BART system is a really good, interesting story because it's built in a 5 foot 6 inch rail gauge, not the 4 foot 8.5 inches, which is kind of universally standard everywhere now. So why is that? So when you read the story about why BART went in this unique way, they say because the BART trains were going to have cars that were much lighter. This probably had something to do with energy, right? Because it's electric, right? And these 800 pounds of 800 pounds per linear foot class of vehicles on the BART system were subject to wind force in a different way, maybe heavier trains were. And so when engineers studied this in detail and looked at all the different metrics that would optimize the BART system, they realized that it was most optimal on a wider rail gauge, which is the 5 foot 6 came in. And you could do it for specialized circumstances, right? But you don't need to hook up Amtrak to the BART. They're never going to go across the same tracks. But once you've laid a lot of track down and someone else tries to connect, they're going to have to be on the same rail gauge. Otherwise, you're going to have all this year-in-year costs, right? This kind of switching costs.
Right.
And I think this is an interesting analogy to where BIM is, because one can say that the RVT file format is like rail gauge. And we can say that the industry would be most optimal if any kind of data, which is a payload, could travel anywhere it needs to travel freely and optimally on an open standard that was somehow fluid, not one that is a lock people into some kind of, standard that's closed.
Mm-hmm.
And or the RVT file format is closed. And if you control platform, you can gate it. And if you can gate it, you can keep your rivals out.
Right.
And so this gets back to where those European organizations are looking at this picture of competitiveness in AEC, and they're looking at local markets and local tools and local circumstances, which are a lot like the BART story, where you want to optimize something very ideally around particular needs.
Mm-hmm. And
it requires that you not go with some kind of standard. You break away from it. And that's more optimal economically to break. And we are in a problem. We're in a state in AEC where people can't do that. Or they're struggling to do that. They can. It's not, we don't have I wouldn't call Autodesk a true monopoly. They have enormous power, but you can leave. You're not trapped.
Sure. Well, one of the stories that you have in there, I think it was it Zaha or Big who went from Revit to ArchiCAD, but ended up coming back, right? I mean, so there was a switch that did happen, and then were ultimately forced. You don't get into it why, but I'm sure there's some interesting stories in there.
So the story is I think that so they were on Revit, and then they jumped to ArchiCAD, and then they ended up. There was it gets to these externalities, right? The negative one being that it's hard to find ArchiCAD people, which is what was cited in the article.
Right.
It's much easier to find Revit people.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a lot like, you can call people like the existing inventory of rail cars, right? There happen to be built for. There's a lot more of them that fit on this track, right? So they didn't tell me much about all of the difficulties that they faced with ArchiCAD. I don't think it came down to product, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have to do with product. In fact, it had to do with these externalities.
Yeah, I mean, it really
does. It had to do with the efficiency ratio of having more people who can just be pulled from this project, that project. Right. And for a while they had overlap, right? So as you're transitioning back, they'd overlap. And I'm sure people were like, no, we want to stay on ArchiCAD. So we're like, no, we should just move over to the one platform. Jen said at one time, I asked him if he imagined the ideal system, and he painted a picture where Autodesk created the ideal system, and you can go end to end and handle anything.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I'm not sure if that's very realistic. And I said, no, I don't think it's very realistic at all.
Right.
I think specialization, if you look at the history of technology, it gets more specialized as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I ended my article, by noting that the real limit to optimization in AEC right now, in terms of these tools, is probably industry concentration itself. In other words, the company that's too big is trying to do everything for everyone.
Yeah.
And because you reach critical mass where you're just not swift. Steve Jobs used to say, if you want to change the world, you only need 25 people. That's what his team for the Mac was 25 people.
Mm-hmm.
I think he should have said a corollary, which he should have said a corollary that was like, if you never want to change the world, have 1,000 people or something like that. Because you're not going to be able to do it with a big team. Yeah. I think there's a lot of books out there that are talking about the exponential speed of change of technology, right? And that's an interesting concept in itself. If we're going faster with technology, it's just not possible for humans to manage it all.
Right.
And so it's better to let capital be free to go after all these problems without the the looming threat that they're going to be turned into a feature in the big platform, which is what happens, which is the big complaint about big tech right now, is that, you can invest a lot to start a company that addresses very specific problem and be very successful, but then, Apple or Google might just write that feature into their operating system, and you're just killed, because now you don't have to pay for it anymore.
Right.
I don't think that AEC solutions, the problems that the AEC industry faces, will be solved that way. I think some of them can and some of them can't.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that kind of has been one of Autodesk's big MOs, right? Is finding those, purchasing them, integrating them, or getting rid of them, right? I mean, they're the biggest M&A firm in the business, I would assume, as far as gobbling up tech because they can. And people, I just had somebody on the podcast who was acquired by Autodesk and now is an Autodesk employee and could not be happier. Is so thrilled with the direction that they're going with their extended reality and keeping them on and supporting them fully to live out that vision at a larger scale, right? So it's not always a terrible or a sad story, right? A lot of times it is good, and it is the right path for some firms. But yeah, this is a really, really complicated system that we operate within, and it is very difficult to navigate. It's very difficult to switch gears, to get back to the idea of switching costs. I mean, they're huge. And I don't envy any firm out there who's trying to figure this out, but at the same time, be totally reliant on another company to do it for them, right? And demand it through letters, or just plead for things to go better in the future. When that one company is trying to be all things to all people, it's easy to be lost in that audience, I think, as well. So it is a tough place to be. So I'm not sure where things go from here. Are you optimistic about where things are headed in this regard?
I'm not optimistic that pleading and complaining will ever work. Autodesk is a public company.
Yeah.
They need to please shareholders, and
right.
they're gonna do the things that are aimed at the greatest top line and bottom line growth
for them.
And for them.
Yeah.
For them. And that's just smart business. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to do that.
Yeah, right.
So going after high hanging fruit that's difficult to maybe accomplish, especially on 20-year-old code base.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very creaky,
mm-hmm.
not built for the modern world, not built for the cloud. It's just a no-go. And so that's not going to happen. But, the thing is, I think we have to think about being optimistic about this industry in terms that are a little different. I think we have to ask, is the AEC industry best served by one company that is sort of like a super monopoly, or like a monopoly? I like to use industry concentration rather than the term monopoly, because that's like a bad word, monopoly.
Yeah.
But, if we look at, let's just review why monopolies are bad, right? What are the 4 reasons why monopolies are bad? Well, one is they can fix prices pretty high. And especially in a market where we have inelastic demand versus elastic demand, meaning that, gasoline is a good example of inelastic demand, right? Regardless of the price of gas, we're going to show up at the pump to buy it, because we need it. We need to get to work.
Mm-hmm.
So these tools that the industry is dependent on, we need them. And we're going to pay, especially if we're entrenched in a platform, we're going to continue to pay,
right,
to the point where it almost breaks us.
Yeah. Because
there's inelastic demand. It's not as elastic as it could be. It's not elastic as buying different kinds of fruit at the grocery store. Or deciding which movie to go watch. So that's this price fixing power is upsetting to a lot of people, including me, because as you know, and you're probably aware of, the unionization movements that are happening in architecture, is that this industry has always been hard to make money in.
Mm-hmm.
And with the price of education, especially in the United States, being so high, young people, the millennials and the Gen Z, they're just not going to tolerate this. And I think we're going to lose a lot of great, talented people in the industry because of these conditions. So I don't like that. I think the declining product quality it's one of those things where when you've got most of the market and there's not much to gain, what do? You turn your arrow, your cannons to new territory, right? They said this with the first Open Letter. That was part of their rationale for why they dropped the ball. They focus on construction software. The loss of innovation incentive, I mean, that's related to that. You just, you lose incentive if you don't have competitors. Competitors keep you sharp.
Yeah.
And lastly, there is, this thing called cost push inflation. And that's another negative for companies that have monopoly power. It's about raising prices, but they're basically pushing inflation onto you. So one way you can look at the rising the subscription change model is just as a method for cost push inflation. OPEC does this to the world all the time. They want more profit and they could cut supply, and they have power.
Yeah.
So if you give companies a lot of power, you're going to deal with the negative end of that power. If you want to do something about it, and I think a more optimistic direction for the industry to go is to recognize that you have to pull some of that power back to you as the end user. And that's kind of, I think, the most important message that I would like people to get out of not only this podcast, but the article.
What are some ways you see that actually happening? How can firms invest in pulling that power back towards themselves?
I think the industry needs to recognize something really fundamental, which is that the AEC in general is the big laggard in productivity gains in the digital era, where other industries have gained substantially in productivity. It's been so flat. And why is that? There was greater productivity gains in the 60s in construction than there is today. I haven't written enough about this stuff, but it's something I want to get into, but other people have written a lot about it. So here's the thing. I think we have to look at, if you look at the industries that have gained the most, they're spending larger percentage of their total revenues on digital technologies. Architects spend between 1.5% to 3.5% generally. I wouldn't be surprised if someone did a good study, and this was where academia is leaving, kind of disappointing me with the industry. There's no one studying these problems, or very few people that I know. I don't see them. But someone should be studying these problems. The firms that spend, I wouldn't be surprised if the firms that spend the least on digital technologies are the ones that are having the least productivity gains. Now that sounds like music to the ears of people who sell software, of course. They want to sell more of it.
Right.
But in order to sell more of it, you have to deliver software that gives people productivity gains so they can afford to pay more of it.
Right.
And the Open Letter is flatly saying, we're not seeing that happening, but you're raising prices. So what should people do? I think they should take back power by, this is where Milton Friedman's quote comes in, right? They need to look at competitors.
Need to see have value. Yeah, it is. So voting with their feet, voting with their dollars, right?
Voting with their dollars,
with their time, and it is an investment, not an expense, right? That this is one of those things where, like, the industry is crying to the one person who they think could make it better, but they're not looking at themselves. Like, you have to look in the mirror and say, what are we willing to do to put some of our money where our mouth is, right? So that we can actually, and I think, this kind of gets back to what you were talking about in school, where people we're trained to go it alone. There is no like organizing within the industry. I mean, that's what an attempt is being made at with these open letters, right? These firms are getting together. They are talking about this openly, which is a great step in the right direction. But it's just got to go farther than that. But that has to happen a lot more, and it needs to happen at those higher levels across industry and not only within individual firms.
I agree. And we're seeing that also with the unionization. I link these two movements together. I think the open letter movement and the unionization movement with the younger architects are completely related. I see them as part of the same overall problem, which is poor economics, poor attention to the economics of the architecture industry. And I think the academy needs to address that.
Yeah,
I strongly believe that the academy, but the firms have to bear responsibility, and they're making a smart step by organizing together with these open letters and reaching out to these, the equivalent of the AIAs in these other countries in Europe and so forth.
Yeah, where is the AIA in this here? Yeah,
that's a topic for another day.
It is. It definitely is. Well, Anthony, this has been a fantastic conversation. Is there anything that we've missed that we should finish off with, or have we covered it all?
I think we've covered it all. The economist David mentions, technical interrelatedness, economies of scale, and this quasi-irreversible investment. That last one, that term, quasi-irreversible investment, this idea that you can't pull back from where you've gone, that you've gone too far down the road. Well, the economist Thomas Sowell has this great book on economic fallacies, and one of them is the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, sunk cost. Yep.
Sunk cost fallacy. It's a fallacy.
Yeah.
You can't pull back. I think people need to vote with their dollars, and organizing. And if it means taking it to government, I think the European architects have a very legitimate set of concerns relative to their policymaking over there, which is much more oriented protecting the consumer with data ownership. Some of the things that they're talking about have to do with American companies buying up European companies. And then where's the data being stored for these European customers?
Who controls it, right?
Who controls it?
Yeah. This really is about taking control of your own destiny and having the guts to be bold and to do that, right? It is easier to look over there and blame the other for your circumstances, but I think it is the call to action to look in the mirror, right, and to take responsibility. Absolutely.
Right. And that brings us to this one final point about the article, which you didn't mention, which I was surprised, which is the section called Superman Syndrome.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Lay that out.
Yeah. So, it's funny because architects are kind of, we hear stories about Frank Lloyd Wright, who wore a cape and gloves, and they're superheroes, right? In the world of design, they can tackle anything, but they're like Supermen. But when it comes to digital technology and technology in general, they're much more like Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent, extremely conservative and cautious. So in the paper, I mentioned this reference to, I think it's a Forbes or a Fortune article. That's brilliant. It talks about the old saying, nobody got fired for buying IBM.
Right.
And the article explores that. And the excerpt in the article is, or the title is like, why didn't they? In other words, they probably deserve to, right? And there's a great part this is a great section in the article, in the article I wrote, but it's a highly recommended article for anyone who's reading my article to read that article. And there's a link to it because it explains that IBM's history behind that quote had a lot to do with that the company had a track record and reputation where they would never take on things that they knew they could not deliver on. Right. That's a different kind of gravitas than the gravitas that we're hearing these open letter firms talk about with Autodesk. The gravitas there is centered around personal security, about making sure that you don't lose your job by going in this other direction with a platform. It's much more self-preservationist. So in terms of being Superman versus Clark Kent, I think we need Clark Kent to go away when it comes to technology. We need to reverse. Actually, the roles Clark Kent is probably a better architect for the social well-being of all mankind. And architects would be better off if, when it comes to technology, they acted more like Superman. In other words, they were much more bold. Yeah, that's what I think.
And the stakes are higher, right? Like it is not the safe decision, right? Which is what you're talking about. I think I heard Simon Sinek, who's a author, say, I believe it was on his Instagram feed, that Fortune 500 company CEOs make $50 million plus per year, and their job is to keep that job as long as possible, and it is to not screw with the machine. Those companies are set. They're there. They're on the list. They're doing well. It took a lot to get there. Don't mess with it, right? So there's very little risk being taken by those CEOs to do something new. And that happens in most firms across the world, right? Those are the same mentality happens. And it's not just the CEOs, right? It's the BIM managers. It's the IT directors. And it's safe on top of safe, on top of safe, on top of safe. And that really is, where there is risk, there is the potential for higher reward and failure, right? So fail fast. It's funny to watch Elon take over Twitter, right? It's like fail fast, fail every single day, and do it in public. And it is happening. And at the same time, like that is a business that has to make money. And it's going to be fun to watch how that actually happens, or if it just completely fails, but he's willing to take a $44 billion bet on that. And everybody's back judging that and talking about how stupid it is, but they're also the ones making the safest decisions they possibly can on a day-to-day basis, right? And so those are two very different mindsets. And I don't know that that's a great analogy, but it just came to mind. I do see the lack of ability to take risks in architecture really driving a lot of the problems of where architecture is today.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the thing that's a key point made in the Nobody Gets Fired for Buying IBM article is that firms that encourage their leadership and their employees to take calculated risks build skills that are very valuable. And I think this is really important as we approach the era of AI, where the element of human judgment is going to be even more important than ever before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Well, Anthony, this has been a fun conversation. I'm glad I'm really happy with where that ended too. I do feel like there is a wake up call necessary, but these firms have to make that call from themselves. And I'm hoping and I'm rooting for the ones that do, because the future of the profession depends on it. I do think we need to step back and think a lot more if the future of this profession, if the profession deserves to exist in the future. It's not going to just get to exist, right? There are many market forces. There are many social forces. There's so many things putting pressure on this profession. And it doesn't just deserve to exist because it's always been here. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we owe the future of this profession? And for those who are willing to kind of step out of the deadline-driven mentality of what day-to-day architecture is and work on the profession, I'm rooting for those people for sure. And that's a big reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, why you're doing what you're doing, kind of getting people around this water cooler to really discuss these ideas out in the open and spread them. So I appreciate what you're doing at Architosh and appreciate you.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate what you're doing too with your podcast and everything else you're doing. We're in the same boat at some level.
Yeah. All right. I will put links to where everybody can follow along and to these articles, but also to Architosh and you on social media, the blog, etc. So anything else that you want to point people toward when they're looking to follow more what's going on with Architosh?
No, architosh.com. You can find us on Instagram now and kind of a new thing, and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter.
All the socials.
Twitter's around.
Yep. All right.
As long as Twitter is around, we're there.
All right, man. Until next time.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you to Avail for their support of this podcast episode. Visit getavail.com to see their holistic approach to content management today. This show is part of the Gabled Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gabledmedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. trxl.co. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for eTroxel. Talk to you soon.